Three, two, one. All right, code keepers and fellow classmates, we're ready for another great class led by our great professor. Go ahead and clap. Go ahead and clap. Get your applause in. Yep. Doc's about to do it again. Doc, the floor is, or the podium, the classroom is yours.
All right, so this week we are talking about Black women who are active and involved in liberation. And this is centuries regarding race for Black women and thousands of years as African women being the trailblazers and the leaders. So we're going to first start off with Shirley Graham Du Bois. So the quote here from Shirley Graham Du Bois is, "We are a race of artists. What are we doing about it?" So I talk a lot about art because art is a part of everything. And that should also sound similar because I talk a lot about Harold Cruz, and Harold Cruz talks about Black art as the foundation of our progress politically and economically, because Black artists are the core of political and economic development, because Black artists are the scholars and the intellectuals. So that's also where you should know that W.E.B. Du Bois did poetry before he met Shirley Graham Du Bois, because he included poetry in the souls of Black folks and so forth. But Shirley Graham Du Bois herself was an artist, composer, actor, director, producer, and musician. So those are the roles that Shirley Graham Du Bois had before she met Dr. W.B. Du Bois. And so she actually did well in applying that. So that's also where that quote, "We are a race of artists, what are we doing about it?" connects with her mission to connect everything to our culture. So this is something to understand. So Shirley Graham Du Bois was part of African American theater, and Shirley Graham Du Bois experienced a lot of inequities when it comes to race and also gender. So the combination interlocking being a Black woman, and of course there are other identities and experiences that go along with that as well. So she had that experience when she was doing the African American theater. Now, she's very specific. When she left the African American theater, she did not leave because of the issues of race and gender. She actually left to get a better salary. So that's when she went to the YWCA USO. So that's the United Service Organization, which provides resources for military service women and men. And this is interesting because when Shirley Graham Du Bois was working YWCA for the United Service Organization, she was actually terminated from the United Service Organization because she spoke out against racism at a conference. This is something I always want our people to remember. When we are invited and included in various places where it's people who are not of our racial and ethnic identity, remember that you can be added. It doesn't mean that your perspective and your expression will be welcome. And also, there are times where you're told to speak out about certain topics like injustice, but as Black people, as Africans, we have to know that when you're given permission to speak out, number one, that's a warning sign to be given permission in the first place, because that means that our people cannot say or do anything without getting a permission slip sign. So therefore, if you're told to speak up, speak out, I encourage our people to not use that as the opportunity to do so. Unfortunately, Shirley Graham Du Bois did. She thought that it was an environment that was welcoming her to speak up because United Service Organization was considered quite liberal and inclusive at that time. But again, that's that life lesson. When you feel included as long as it's comfortable for everyone else. So always be careful to not accept every invitation to be outspoken. All right. And Brother Varner and I can talk about what that means back then and also 2025 and the future as well. So
True.
this is where you want to add to that now, Brother Varner?
No, I just true. True that.
Yeah, so we'll touch on that more because that's something that our people need to understand. And I want our people to understand also from a Du Bois perspective and a Paul Laurence Dunbar and even Sam Greenlee's The Spook Who Sat by the Door. You got to understand the double consciousness, dual identity, the veil, the mask. These are different writings from Black scholars over the centuries. That is something that our people have always talked about. That's not a new thing. When people talk about code switching, imposter syndrome, I want our people to learn centuries of the veil, the mask, the dueling identity, the double consciousness, all the different work. Even if you don't agree with every component of what's explained in that, you want to understand what has been explained by our people for centuries. Okay. So this is also when being terminated from the USO, that's when Shirley Graham Du Bois became more involved with the NAACP. And so, of course, you understand the co-founders of the NAACP include Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and then they had some collaborative co-founders who were non-Black as well. So this is where Shirley Graham Du Bois began to highlight Black worker struggle. So during Jim Crow, she was very involved in that component. And this is also where it's interesting when understanding Shirley Graham Du Bois, because I always want our people to understand the historical origins of Pan-Africanism and also Black nationalism, because they're not synonymous, but you want to understand the origins. So the origins, it's not everyone go back to Africa. Those are certain components for some people who hold on to those beliefs over the century, but that's not what Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism are from its origins. And that's not 100% what everyone believes. Instead, it's a notion that we're creating some space. It doesn't mean we're creating our own nation, doesn't mean we're getting an island somewhere. And Pan-Africanism does not mean that we're all going to get millions of people together to go back to Africa. It's important to understand that now. It's important to understand that back then. And we'll talk about the historical need for Africans in America for centuries to stop pretending that you're going to be barefoot backpacking across African lands, because that is a huge insult and it's a huge tourism problem as well. All right. So the fact that Shirley Graham Du Bois emphasized race a lot, this is where Shirley Graham Du Bois leaned more towards Pan-Africanism than she did Marxism. So of course, back then, a century or so ago, it was understandable that our people relied on Karl Marx, Frederick Engels a lot, and Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. They relied on European socialism, which is a component of American capitalism already. And they relied on components of communism as well. We understand that a century ago because there weren't many outlets, there weren't many sources to understand the African origins of economic approaches. And there wasn't an understanding. We talk about conflict theory in sociology. There was an understanding of that beyond European components of power conflict. So Marxism was very prevalent. I still am very adamant. I tell our people, you can learn it, you can integrate components of it, which Harold Cruz explains as well. But I don't believe in our people becoming Marxists. I don't believe in our people becoming communists. So this
Okay.
is where it's also important to highlight. Shirley Graham Du Bois is an illustration of what it means to have some components of something, but she really leaned more towards the Pan-Africanism, because Marxism, no matter how much you call it Black Marxism or you try to integrate race into it, Marxism and communism and even European socialism, which is a huge component of socialism that most people use around the world, it's very falsely race neutral. It pretends to be prioritizing class and pretending that class has this neutral effect on everyone, to the point where when you bring up race, people say that you are not understanding the revolution and the uprising. And if you read about like revolutionary and radical Marxists, you'll understand components of how there are people who try to change that, but either way, it still comes back to understanding that you're adding race to something where the main proponents of it do not believe race is a factor. Like Karl Marx himself did not believe race was a component. So I could talk about that later because I do entire lectures about that in classes. So we can talk about that later. Okay, so this is where, okay. They like to title Shirley Graham Du Bois as becoming a global Black Marxist feminist. Again, I don't believe in giving our people these kinds of titles like Marxist, even if, okay, if they call themselves Marxist, okay. But just understand there's a huge difference between agreeing with something that Karl Marx wrote, because again, Karl Marx was focused on the Western Europe. He did not care about what Africans can contribute. He did not care about what Asians could contribute. He did not care about the indigenous native to Western Hemisphere contributed. He actually did not even care about East Europe until what happened, of course, with the Soviet Union and the communism over on that side that proved themselves to Marx. So you can have components of Marxism without being a Marxist, but people who insist on calling her a Black Marxist, okay. Calling her a feminist is a similar issue with calling her Marxist. We have, since the origins of humans, hundreds of thousands of years of gender, before that terminology of gender even was used among Africans, by the way, we have equity work. We have all types of forms of liberation for girls and women. We have different kinds of African cultures across the entire land before and after it was a continent. And this includes what were considered matriarchy, and this includes neither matriarchy or patriarchy. Instead, it was all people just having different roles and statuses, regardless of their gender and sexuality. So I also don't necessarily call Shirley Graham Du Bois a feminist. Although back then, especially, it was very common to identify as a feminist because people did not really have access to the same resources to understand the work that was done before the white women's suffrage movement, the work that was done before white women who were middle class fought to get into the workplace, whereas Black women and poor white women even were already in the workplace because they had to be. So I wouldn't call Shirley Graham Du Bois a feminist, even if she called herself that, which she might or might not have. I will just say that she was involved in women being active and the voice. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this
Okay.
is where Shirley Graham Du Bois traveled to Europe and to Africa with and without Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois. So that's an example of that liberation. What it means that she, and you'll see it also with Amy Ashwood Garvey, being very involved, going here and there, all over the place. Like I use these women as examples of how you can contribute, collaborate without having to join different organizations. It's like you say, here's where we can collaborate. However, I'm not going to be dedicated to this one side. So she
Right.
was everywhere. And so she also talked to a bunch of different people throughout this time. And she assisted Du Bois when he was on trial for allegedly being a communist agent. So she was helping him during that time. And this was before he formally became a communist, because he aligned with communists, like white Jewish communists were financially supporting him until he formally became a communist when he was in his 90s, by the way. So Shirley Graham Du Bois spent a lot of time with Black religious leaders, Black power leaders, Pan-Africanists, Black socialists, Black Marxists, Black communists, and contributed to Black economic concerns. So she did that through art because that's a form of expression, knowing how to interact, knowing how to communicate, knowing how to find, knowing how to find some of the most pivotal, crucial Black leaders and have conversations with them, and they respected her and how she did that. And so this is the importance of where she wanted to highlight the role of Black women as leaders, not note takers. We're not just going to be your administrative assistant. Okay. Don't tell me to go get you some tea. Okay. Don't tell me to go get you something in the kitchen. All right. We're not just breastfeeding. We're not just doing all that stuff. We're not just the nurturers. All right. We actually have roles as leaders that we have done, and that's not a new thing. And whenever we talk about that, including in many Black organizations, people act like that's a new concept. They're like, oh, y'all done fell for that whole feminist thing. I'm like, well, actually, you need to school yourself on what certain African cultures have done for thousands of years. You need to school yourself on what Black women on this land have done for centuries. All right. So that's not a brand new thing. Yes, Brother Varner. You
All
want
right, so why don't we know more about Shirley Graham Du Bois? We know about W.E. Du Bois. Did they have
to?
children? I don't. You know what? Until you brought Shirley Graham Du Bois up, I was kind of in didn't know about it.
You want an honest answer?
Yeah, go
Oh.
ahead, go ahead.
And and I do work on W.B. Du Bois, and I
Okay,
do a lot of work with regarding his work. It's because men are considered in charge. And the same is the case when it comes to Black men. All right. So whenever there's a topic of Black scholarly leadership, Black writings, a lot of times people will highlight the role of Black men as the trailblazers for a lot of writings over the century. It's a lot more difficult to find Black women's writings. Now, it's interesting because Dr. Anna Julia Cooper's A Voice from the South was published before W.B. Du Bois's first publication, but his publication gets the most attention. So these are all just examples. So it's not necessarily that Black men are doing more. However, you have to understand that if people believe that men are head of household, that men are the leaders of communities, that men are the voices for cultures, and they use very men-centric language like he, and he means everybody, right? Therefore, it's going to not be shocking that you see images of Du Bois everywhere in terms of W.B. Du Bois. Also, W.E.B. Du Bois he was actually very arrogant. And I'm never bothered by arrogance because arrogance and confidence is cool with me. However, that was just one of his personalities. Some of our most popular, most well-known trailblazers over the centuries were the men who were considered very aggressive and arrogant. Whereas when you'll learn about Black women who've been trailblazers, the moment they become very outspoken and arrogant, they become very silenced and sometimes even abused and punished. So, like my father and I write about Amabalo, which I'm going to talk more about Amabalo more often because Amabalo, being in Richmond, Virginia, being a pivotal role in housing conditions in Richmond decades ago, she had a very outspoken personality type. So people are accustomed to that if it's coming from anybody but Black men, but Black women rather.
okay, that's intriguing. So that's intriguing because I knew of his writings.
Hmm.
I I don't hear of her writings. I knew of his personality, and maybe, yeah, it's intriguing. It's intriguing. Let's move on. Let's move on.
Yeah. And Du Bois was also known by his own family and his own secretary, which they called a secretary back then, to be uh arrogant and yeah, that's part of his personality type. And on one end, you understand that because Du Bois did work for like 70 years, right?
Right.
So and his friends were majority white because being from the North, and so the emphasis on racial integration that he and Booker T. Washington fussed like battle rappers, but they actually had a lot in common in terms of the economic health emphasis, education emphasis, racial integration emphasis. Is just that they differed in terms of how racial integration would happen. And so you can understand this is also where like Harold Cruz critiqued W.B. Du Bois's double consciousness because it's like, okay, you're just talking about your consciousness as a Negro because you're mulatto, number one. And Booker T. Washington, of course, was biracial, non-consensually because of white rapist, because he was born
Hmm.
into slavery. But Du Bois being mulatto, being around white people, so maybe he had to have this level of overconfidence to assert himself in these spaces to get the white collaborators who were mostly white Jews, including the Niagara movement. And he possibly had to have that form of assertion to convince Negroes during that time that he actually understands and let's contribute to the changes for our people. And that also happened when people started criticizing his talented 10th evaluation. His talented 10th evaluation, though, is actually very similar to Marcus Garvey's evaluation of who should be considered the leaders of what our people are doing, whether we do it on certain African lands or on the Western Hemisphere.
All right,
So,
well, let's stick to the queens today, though.
okay, so funny. You brought it up.
No, I just thought it was interesting. Thought it was
It is
intriguing.
interesting. It is really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Yep. All right, so this is Amy Ashford Garvey. So Amy Ashford Garvey being an activist, playwright, and Pan-African. So this Amy Ashford Garvey, I do have to introduce her as the first wife of Marcus Garvey. So I do have to say that because in 1914, Amy Ashford Garvey co-founded the UNIA, did I put university up there? I apologize. Because I have my red, black, and green, which, that's what Marcus Garvey presented that flag. So
Right.
pardon the typo of university. I will now be attacked by my fellow UNI Universal Negro Improvement Association. I will change this so that everyone with the link will see
it's
different.
it's
All
it's all
right.
good. They're gonna fart over
Universal
nothing.
Negro Improvement Association with Marcus Garvey, 1914, co-founded and developed a UNIA section for women. So another example of the important role of women and not being submissive, not being silent, but instead actually being very expressive and doing some work for our people. So 1914, from, of course, Jamaica, Amy Ashford Garvey moved to United States of America to help and become the secretary for Marcus Garvey. 1914, Amy Ashford Garvey co-founded the Negro World newspaper with Marcus Garvey. So that's a very prolific newspaper still. Yes, Brother Varner.
All right, just so I can get a frame of reference. When did they get married?
So they got married, let's see, I want to say it was maybe 1915, 1916. Don't make me quote. I
Okay,
didn't put that
okay,
up there
okay.
because I didn't want to talk about that too much. Let's see when she got married.
All
Yes,
right.
you have a question about that though?
No, 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 no. Just I thought it was intriguing that they moved to the U.S. and I
Yes.
just wondered um if if it happened after they were married or
No,
before they were
no.
married. That's
It
all.
happened before they were married.
Okay. So
So
that's
let's see. Yeah, so she met Marcus Garvey in 1914. They actually got married in 1919. And
wow. Okay.
one thing is known is that the marriage quickly broke down, which is also connected to Amy Jackie Garvey, unfortunately. So the marriage did break down. And I was not going to go into all that, but
Uh,
I do have to go into some of it because Amy Jackie Garvey has a part of that. Because when Marcus Garvey filed for divorce, Amy Ashford Garvey is considered to have declined or denied that. But either way, Amy Ashford Garvey was still very active and very involved in this work. So this is where we have to remember she was doing the work before Marcus Garvey and doing the work after Marcus Garvey. And she actually traveled more than Marcus Garvey did. So before the travel part, though, I do want to say that this also is 1919. Amy Ashford Garvey was the secretary and the director of the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation. Now, if you understand the Black Star Line,
mm-hmm.
okay. All right, but here's the reality of the Black Star Line. Despite Marcus Garvey having accountants, they did not do good record keeping. So that is one of the reasons why he was put under investigation. But the connection of under investigation also happened after he was having back and forths with W.B. Du Bois insulting each other. Du Bois called him short, ugly, and Garvey talk about Du Bois because Marcus Garvey had issues of colorism and lighter melanin Negroes, including lighter melanin members of UNIA, made sure that you collaborate, contribute, but you're not going to be at the forefront because the forefront will be our people with the darker melanin, which is understandable because that's part of what Garvey was focusing on. But the also Jamaican socialists contributed to Garvey being under investigation and being imprisoned regarding the financial issues for the Black Star Line. So I always want our people to know those ships were not really ready to, they were damaged and all types of stuff. So
Okay.
you can
Uh,
appreciate Marcus Garvey, celebrate. We go to, Garvey parades and festivals, but still want to understand that Garvey himself critiqued himself. So understand he critiqued himself, and you can read that in Amy Jackie Garvey's writings as well. Okay. So Amy Ashwood Garvey being pivotal because Amy Ashwood Garvey, even after the marriage to Marcus Garvey in 1919, did not last that long. She was moving back and forth from Jamaica, United States of America, Europe, traveling to African countries. This is also profound because Marcus Garvey was not allowed to enter African lands. You got to remember when you see photos of UNIA members, it's never Marcus Garvey himself because he was forbidden from the African presidents and so forth to travel to African lands. That's why he spent most of the time in Europe lands. He spent most of the time in Europe lands before he founded UNIA as well. That's also where he started reading more and more. His father got him into reading. He started reading more and more in Europe. So you'll see him in European lands. And he also compared himself to European leaders a lot too. So when you see videos and images of Garvey, you'll see him in the car. I mean, it's very European because that's also part of you could call, it's a very colonial mindset in that sense.
right.
Unfortunately, he compared himself to Mussolini, but that was because that was back then considered a way to tell people that you're going to make some changes. Now we know that that was not a good comparison. So yeah, so Amy Ashwood Garvey did do a lot of traveling, perhaps more than Marcus Garvey did in terms of being on African lands and actually helping people on African lands. Also, this is important because Amy Ashwood Garvey collaborated with Dr. CLR James. So anyone familiar with CLR James, the wonderful social scientist? I have a lot of writings about CLR James that I can share with people. So CLR James was Trinidadian, Marxist. And he was very honest, though. He was like, yes, he's Trinidadian, but he's European. He said that. He was very honest. He was very honest back then, a century ago, about the colonization, the culture that's integrated in Trinidad and Tobago. And that's very important to understand the honesty of saying, I'm Trinidadian, I'm African, but I'm European. And that's because of the language that he's speaking, style of dress, and all types of other stuff. Of course, his perspective, learning Marxism and all of that, that's a very European mindset because we always tell our people, if you're thinking about radicalism and revolutionary approaches, if the first thing that you choose as your radicalism and revolution and evolution, which is beyond revolution, if your first thing that you think of is some European stuff, even some Asian stuff, like anything that's in lands or that our people created on this Western hemisphere, then that says that you have that mindset that you actually have to change. Yes, Brother Varner.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've all struggled with some level at some point in our lives of indoctrination.
Yeah. And that's why I be telling our people, because, the work I do is based on teaching our people how to integrate stuff, but that can't be your first thought. Like you can't roll up on me trying to debate me on a topic, but you're debating based on European stuff. And you can't debate any of our people in defense of non-blacks, number one. That just is hypocritical, right? And so that's just something to understand. And that's why Amy Ashwood Garvey was very adamant about collaborating with CLR James. And they did the International African Friends of Ethiopia to address Italy colonial attempts. So remember, one of the shout outs that we do for Ethiopia when we do like African Liberation Days and everything else, and also we even talk about Pan-Africanism and the Pan-African colors, and you look at Rastafarianism with the Rastafarian colors, you're looking, of course, at Haile Selassie and everything, and understanding the role that Ethiopia had to play. So the Italy did fail at being a colonizer. However, there's still European impact in Ethiopia. There's still Arab Muslim colonizer impact in Ethiopia that shapes religions and everything. And also for Ethiopia to surpass this stronger prevalence of Italy, Ethiopia had to dominate over surrounding African cultures as well on the eastern part of Africa. And that's an unfortunate component that's required when talking about how to overcome the invaders. Unless everyone's going to unite to do it, sometimes you're going to have to overpower others. So that's an interesting, unfortunate component to understand that. All
Okay.
right, so this is where there's also the International African Service Bureau. So that is something that came from the International African Friends of Ethiopia. And it co-created with colleagues such as CLR James, George Padmore. So that's where Amy Ashford Garvey again was doing so much work. She co-created the International African Service Bureau to expand beyond Ethiopia. And if you know George Padmore, Pan-Africanism, so I also have some writings regarding George Padmore, an entire book. So it's important to also understand the contributions of George Padmore. But like I said earlier, even when you read older work from people like George Padmore that focuses on Africa, you want to understand the original purpose of Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism was actually for Africans all around the world to understand what we created around the world, particularly for centuries, because we're not going to say, you know, we've created everything around the world for thousands of years. Instead, it's like our populations were past 5 centuries, right? So therefore, what do we create? And what are our common denominators as Africans? And what are we doing to progress our people, health-wise, education, economic-wise? So that's the real purpose. So even when you read like George Padmore, you can't focus on improving our people on African lands without understanding that if you don't know how to improve your people next door to you, where you're located in USA, or the city you're located, then don't you dare think that you're gonna, and also it's a very Europeanized, Westernized, Americanized savior syndrome that's actually quite white. So it's actually quite insulting. Yeah. You were gonna say something, Brother Varner.
Yeah, I thought this is the Padmore piece is something we'll have to dive into. Uh,
Hmm.
so uh, that was first wife. That was wife number one.
Yes, wife
Extremely
number,
important, extremely influential.
yeah, co-founding and huge contributions. Amy Ashford Garvey is prolific because that was part of the origins of UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Okay.
Well, he
Now
liked
this is
women named
where,
Amy. I can tell
yeah.
that.
Okay, so here's what I have to say. I have a little asterisk here because Amy Ashford Garvey was replaced by Amy Jackie Garvey, not just in marriage, but as the chief aide and personal secretary. So in 1920, right after, a year after Amy Ashford Garvey and Marcus Garvey got married, then Amy Jackie Garvey came in as the chief aide and personal secretary for Marcus Garvey. So I do have to say here, I do have to say that again, Amy Jackie Garvey and Marcus Garvey did eventually get married. And it is a little shady there because Amy Ashford Garvey and Amy Jackie Garvey were friends, roommates, and Amy Jackie Garvey was part of the wedding for Amy Ashford Garvey and Marcus Garvey. So I will just say that.
Oh, well, all right. The thing about Amy Jackie Garvey that intrigues me
Hmm.
is this wide awake woman quote. That so can we say that she's the progenitor of the term woke? Was she woke before Erica Badu?
Well, first of all, Black people have said some form of woke for generations, right? Yeah, you know. So I always want people, like whenever you hear people since 2016 outraged over woke, they're wasting that outrage, number one. And also a lot of Black elders have never heard the term woke because it sounds like a contemporary thing. And this is where you just have to talk about it in terms of what does it mean to be conscious? And that's again like an example of the double consciousness, dual identity. So you don't have to think about like a woke, like how news outlets are presenting it now. Also, we can think about from like a Spike Lee, wake up kind of. That's why I always example I use school days, kind of wake up. So whenever people talk about white people created this notion of woke from the Enlightenment era, because the Enlightenment era was a time where they were changing the criminal justice system and everything. As a criminologist and a sociologist, I always tell people, I'm not giving non-blacks everything, okay? The Enlightenment era is a time of enlightenment in terms of understanding some progressive approaches to make changes, but that was not the first time humans said, hey, let's make some changes, okay? So instead, we have to understand that our people have had components of wake up, woke, and even on BET back in the early 2000 when I don't know why I'm forgetting his name, but he's one of my favorite news anchors. He used to have a show on CNN, but he used to have a late night talk show on BET where he would say, "Don't sleep." So his theme was "Don't sleep."
I remember that. I remember that.
Yeah,
Don't
I don't
sleep.
know why I'm forgetting his name. So yeah,
So,
so
but you saying that Amy and Amy were roommates and friends.
yeah, and Amy Jackie Garvey was actually part of the wedding for Amy Ashford Garvey and Marcus Garvey. Yeah.
Intriguing. Okay, that's.
Yeah.
I mean, it is what it is, but it's intriguing nonetheless.
Yeah. So Amy Jackie Garvey wrote publications for Garvey and UNIA, and such as the column for the UNIA newspaper, The Negro World. So you can actually find a lot of these online. If you look up The Negro World, you can get the website and the PDF. And Amy Jackie Garvey was actually quite outspoken, talking about the role of women. And this is a quote that I have up here: the doll baby type of woman is a thing of the past. The wide awake woman is forging ahead, ready to answer the call. So Amy Jackie Garvey actually did presentations and writings talking about the role of women. And so this is where I just have the wide awake woman quote is from the Women as Leaders writing, which is the Negro World. That's October 1925, which is actually very profound for it to be a century ago. And you can actually find that entire part online. And at the end of this PowerPoint slide, I have some links to stuff. And there's different components because Amy Jackie Garvey was very hardcore. Amy Jackie Garvey was like, look here, Black women, we have to take the lead on this because these Black men don't know what they're doing. Basically, it's a long story short. She's like, they don't know what they're doing, child. So we got to ante up and we got to do this. And what in the speech or the writing rather, she mentioned yellow people. So she was really talking about, when she says yellow, she's talking about non-Black, but also non-European. So in other words, this idea that if we don't take charge, we'll be taken over by anybody. So that's also what she meant by yellow people. That and that could be Asian dominance, because remember the original colonizers of Africa were Arab Muslims, and they're racially categorized as Asian. So that's the harming of the Nubians in northern Africa, and that spread across all of Africa. And thousands of years later, of course, that impacts the entire world, including religions, Islam, how it's represented, and colorism was introduced first by Arab Muslim colonizers, and colorism was a big deal for Marcus Garvey. And that was before racial categories were created by Europeans. So before we had race, we actually had color, the notions of the importance of melanin. And so that's something that's not just Black people, that colorism is in Europe, Asian nations, indigenous, this value of lighter skin, thinner features, finer textured hair is all around the world. So this is why I do want to highlight that Amy Jackie Garvey did change her perspective after Garvey passed away. So this is something Marcus Garvey unfortunately died young in his 50s, which is sad for many reasons, including since he co-founded the Black Cross Nurses. So what it means to be so active and involved in helping our people, including the Black Cross Nurses, and unfortunately dying young yourself. So Amy Jackie Garvey is also an example, though, that for Black women, you contribute, you collaborate, but you don't hold on to this one's perspective. You don't say, I have to always be a member of this organization. I have to do what they tell me to do. And this is why I always tell our people to distinguish contributions and collaborations and passions for helping our people, distinguish that from cults, because the cult would be collectives that tell you this is what you better believe, or at least pretend you better believe it, right? and this is what you better do. And don't try to have discussions. Don't try to have counter viewpoints. Don't try to do something different. So this is where Amy Jackie Garvey was very different compared to UNIA's representation. Marcus Garvey was very big on calling out UNIA members when they were schemers, scammers, which is understandable, but also different approaches that might have been presented. So Amy Jackie Garvey became very outspoken about, of course, because UNIA is based in capitalism, because Marcus Garvey learned from Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. So it's based on Black capitalism. And of course, this capitalism is already integrated with components of European socialism.
All right.
However, after Marcus Garvey passed, Amy Jackie Garvey leaned further into socialism, and she wanted to collaborate with Jamaican socialists, which is interesting because they were part of the investigation of Marcus Garvey. She wanted to collaborate with W.B. Du Bois. So I have the letter that she wrote to W.B. Du Bois. It was like more than a decade after the last correspondence between Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois, probably like 20 years after that. So Amy Jackie Garvey was just ready to say, okay, let's see, there's different approaches. It didn't mean necessarily she wanted to get rid of capitalism altogether, perhaps just leaning more towards socialism. And that's actually very prevalent in capitalist nations as well. So it's actually quite normal. So you can also find the book Garvey and Garveyism by Amy Jackie Garvey. It's difficult to find the hard copy. You can try to find electronic versions and hope that somebody got the hard copy in their attic, in their basement, something like that. Sometimes you'll find older Black scholars that might have a hard copy, or older UNIA members who've been UNIA members for a long time. There's a book that I have a link to at the end of the PowerPoint slide called The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jackie Garvey. So you can access that free online. And then The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, edited by Amy Jackie Garvey. So you can find the original one. There's also an edited version, which, well, I say edited, but there's also one that has like a new forward. So people add something to it over the past 5 or 10 years. So I always prefer to find the original versions of writings, including when you find W.B. Du Bois and other old writings from a century ago. You understand why they have to update it to get it accessible. However, you do want to know what was originally in it, right? And so the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, you can find different versions online. You just have to compare the pages and see, just make sure everything's legitimate. Any questions or thoughts about Amy Jackie Garvey?
No, this is intriguing.
Yeah, Sister Amy Jackie Garvey. All right. And last but definitely not least, Septima Clark. So this is a wonderful quote from Septima Clark here. And a lot of people have seen a photo of Septima Clark all over the place, because you see a photo of an elderly Black woman with silver cornrows and she's standing to the side. That's Septima Clark's photo. So a lot of people have seen it. They just don't realize that's Septima Clark. So I always talk about this because her being from South Carolina, at Charleston. So being from Charleston, South Carolina, which is where my father and his side of the family are from. So he was actually my Aunt Nita's, Septima Clark was my Aunt Nita's teacher. And when my dad was in elementary school, he used to see Septima Clark in the hallway. She was never my dad's teacher, but he would see her in the hallway. And he would say that she just had a very assertive. She was never loud, but you could tell she was in charge. So she was a very quiet personality type, but just very much in charge. And so I have the book, The Freedom's Teacher, The Life of Septima Clark. Brother Varn and I have done the show about Septima Clark before. And actually, when you do a YouTube search, you can look up her name. You can find her interviews where she was interviewed. Most of the interviews, she's very soft spoken, so sometimes you can't really hear her. So a lot of the interviews have transcriptions, so you can read what she says. And the interview that I like to share the most is a very long interview, but it's very good because she's very calm. And she also talks about Ella Baker, because through Ella Baker, Septima Clark met a lot of people. I think she met Coretta Scott King through Ella Baker. Ella Baker was very much more outspoken. Septim Clark also explains how she and Ella Baker had similar experiences in dealing with men dominance. Black men not wanting Black women to be in that role of leadership and outspokenness. And she explains that. Ella Baker, the difference is that Septima Clark would not fuss with anybody. Septima Clark was like, understood it's a time waster to try to school people, no pun intended for her being a teacher, but she considered it a time waster to try to explain to people, hey, stop trying to control us. Because people are going to do what they do, especially if, unfortunately, Black people think that dominance is a part of our culture. They're going to still do that, and they're going to try to ostracize you when you explain why you shouldn't do it, right? So Septima Clark, instead of wasting time telling Black men we deserve to be here, she was like, I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna do my part, and y'all going back and do whatever. Ella Baker, on the other hand, was like, I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna do some things, right? She was just more outspoken. So yes, you can find those interviews online. You can read the transcripts. So Septima Clark is different, very different from the Du Bois, Garvey, and Garvey, in that Septima Clark's focus was not to be considered an activist. Instead, it was a teacher. So she wasn't all over the place. She was not traveling all over the place, because what she wanted was a central focus, which I think is very important for our people to understand, that we can't all be all over the place, because you have to have evidence that something's being accomplished if you're bragging about being all over the place, right? So Septima Clark stayed in that South Carolina area, but she had so much of an impact that even Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and that's before he was a doctor, responded to Septima Clark. So Septima Clark taught adults, Black adults, to read newspapers, read books, learn about the sciences, mathematics, and voting ballots. So in other words, not just relying on schools, but teaching each other. And this is what I'm very adamant about. I don't like for our people complaining about schools all the time, because if our families are not reading, which is our, that's the component of our culture. Like Harold Cruz says, culture is the foundation of our people's progress, right? So if your family not reading together, the adults in the family does not want you to give them a book because they tell you they're not going to read either way. If reading is not in our communities, now we were the first people to put those little miniature libraries on street corners, right? But now people think white liberals created that. Why? Because Black people have become known to not read despite us struggling to learn how to read, right? So if we have that component of our culture that we keep perpetuating generation to generation, and then people want to blame schools and politicians and government, then we have to understand that's a recipe for disaster, right? So Septima Clark was one of the trailblazers who said, look here, y'all, I don't care how much we complain about voting rights and stuff. If someone gives you a right to vote and you brought a ballot, but you don't know how to read and you don't know how to actually sign your name and stuff, you agree into their recipe for disaster instead of understanding the Black liberation and Black freedom. Okay, so this is where Septima Clark taught our people, specifically adults, to write their names, sign their names in cursive. This is for voting ballots and for other documents, and utilizing Black organizations and Black religious collectives to provide basic learning tools designed for Blacks. So use the various organizations that our people have, because we do have a lot of organizations that are doing important work, but that wasn't always the case, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we have organizations that for centuries have contributed to work, but when people become too emphasized on racial integration, and I blame NAACP and other organizations for that are making a whole lot of money from sponsors, most of whom are not Black. Racial integration is a central component of NAACP, right? So when integration and all of that becomes so important, the organizations that are doing a lot of work to provide resources and tools for our people will sometimes be more difficult to access. And I will end it on that one. All right, so this is where September. You want to say something, Brother Varner?
I don't know if they're focused on integration, but it seems like their outcomes are. I've been a member of the NAACP. I think you have as well at some point. I'm still active with the Virginia Beach, and it's interesting that even though that doesn't seem to be a focus, it seems that the civil rights soldiers, that generation is really focused on integration in a way that still disturbs them. And that's a conversation for another day.
Well, no, I will just say that that is the central focus of NAACP. So you have to remember how it was founded. So Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, and then their white contributors,
Mm-hmm.
including white Jews. And then Ida B. Wells criticized Du Bois. She criticized Du Bois a lot, by the way, which I enjoy that. She criticized Booker T. Washington also. Ida B. Wells was going at it. She was a battler, I'm telling you. But one of her criticisms is that Du Bois went too far on the racial integration emphasis. And so, and I agree, because that became the central component of NAACP, which is why NAACP terminated Du Bois more than once. Du Bois got terminated from NAACP because his approach, I mean, he still was a racial integrationist in a sense, but then the Pan-Africanism and then adding components of communism, NAACP was like, we're not having that. And so
Yeah,
and NAACP to this day, I don't care in what city and state you are in, when you go to their table, when you go to their event, they're going to preach to you about voting rights. Usually nothing more. Okay. Their collaborators and contributors are mostly non-Black, despite their membership being Black people mostly. Okay. You will go to certain chapters and their spokesperson is not a Black person. I've literally had that happen to me where they're like, oh, go talk to so-and-so. And they want me to talk to someone who's not even Black. Okay. So,
yeah. Our membership chair is white. So yeah, I know what
yeah.
you mean.
So congratulations. So NAACP is 100% about racial, NAACP is 100% about racial integration since its origins. Ida B. Wells called it out. You're so funny.
Okay, okay,
Ida B.
okay.
Wells called it out in terms of, you took it from, and this is where our people have to understand this in 2025 and beyond as well. We got to understand from centuries, right? You can look back to slave abolitionists who were white, right? Understand the difference between contributing to something, collaborating with something versus being in charge, right? And our people have had a difficult time creating those boundaries. All
Okay,
right.
okay,
Very difficult
okay,
time.
okay.
And NAACP is a model of that difficult time, unfortunately. So a lot of times, if you have some real change making work to do, you do not go to NAACP to get that done. And I'm going to say it, and people can be mad, but I say instead of being mad, get sad that this is a well-funded organization that's going to keep going on, and it's not going to do change-making work, which is why it's going to get the most funds. The change-making work collectives of our people are the ones that are going to have the least funds. Okay, that's why we have to get stuff out of our own pockets for ourselves. Brother, get your hand out my pocket. Okay, so this is where Septima Clark said, we cannot have protests without actions for changes, okay? So this is where on page 319 of the book, Freedom's Teacher, Septima Clark talked about direct action. So there's a quote on page 319. And again, she was talking about young Black people at that time, but this applies to everyone. And I tell this to our people, whether you're talking about boycotts or anything you're talking about, if that's okay, and you and I've talked about that before. If you're talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
protests, marching down the street, if you're talking about boycotting the store and it's not real results, you just did it because it's like surface level, you feel proud. Black pride is beyond that. And if it's not beyond that, and now we're at 2025 and it's still not beyond just feeling proud, then
I think we demonstrated on April 5th that some of us are done.
April 5th, what happened April 5th?
Nothing for us.
Oh, what was supposed to happen on April
But
5th?
there was a million person march.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but um you saw the memes, right?
It was a April 5th was
Get
a
your black down.
it was a peaceful day for me. Just like, but I also tell our people the same. I have the same perspective when people talked about boycotting Target. Again, Target still has Black-owned businesses that they sell their products. So you have to understand work beyond the title. Just because somebody takes their official diversity statement down or their DEI statement down, which DEI was never created for us in the first place, by the way, just
Hmm.
because they take it down, you got to think back to affirmative action. And I have plenty of writings regarding affirmative action that I can share with people, including Derek Bell, who, of course, is credited with doing critical race theory, but Derek Bell did much more than critical race theory. He also talked about the pros and cons of affirmative action, how it went into effect, but then starting a long time ago, we're talking about decades ago, it stopped being about Black people. Okay. So
Well,
understand that with
that's
DEI, if you're boycotting stuff because of the DEI title, understand that you are proving the entire point that you don't care about results. What you care about is smiles and titles and nothingness. Okay.
I think it's a little deeper than that, but I don't disagree that.
What's the deeper? Tell me the deepness.
Well, I'm not ready for that.
Okay. What's
I,
that old
okay,
song?
I'm
Deeper
just.
and deeper. Okay. All right. People love to say it's deeper than that. I want it to be proven it's deeper than that. It has to be proven until places say that they're no longer servicing Black-owned businesses, that they're actually harming employees. Until there's evidence of that, then the DEI title being removed means nothing. So why are you boycotting it for that? And why are you boycotting it while walking around with a Starbucks cup in your hand and not understanding what Starbucks has been critiqued for doing over the past 20 years? So this is where,
Some people are anti Starbucks as well.
yeah, but you don't have to be anti everything. But I always say, like, I don't watch NFL, but I don't expect everyone else to boycott NFL. I've just boycotted NFL for more than 10 years. So it just has to be understanding that the protest, the boycotts, it has to be an outcome. If you want it to actually be something formal for our people and not just like an individual preference, like I have my own individual preferences. I don't watch cable news networks. I think they're all scammers and liars, but I don't expect all Black people to get them removed off their cable um, contract. So this again, it has to be protest with change making work. The
Well,
protest is not the change making work.
I think when you look at what Jamal Bryant did, even though I can't say I'm fully supported, I think that the plan and the planned outcome and the demand for something uh, would meet makes it deeper than just saying we're not going to Target. But I don't have all my facts in front of me,
Yeah.
hey, look, I am not going to go into a battle rap
I'm
without
not
my
battling.
lyrics.
I'm just saying when you say Jamal Bryant presented something, I need to know what he presented that was considered relevant.
All right. Well, I tell you what, that'll be another show because I think that it was intriguing. It didn't capture me as heavily as I think it captured some other people.
Well,
But
a
I
lot of
do think
people,
it was interesting. And I think it was a movement in the right direction. Like when some people talk about, marching didn't help then and it's not helping now. But during that civil rights period, it was more than just the marches. And I don't think a lot of us understand it was more than just what people saw.
right. The marches were the surface. And this is also one thing that Septima Clark critiqued. This is also on this PowerPoint slide. Clark
Right.
was very critical of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. because he led marches without follow-up work. And that's also on page 319.
But
She
the
was she
organizations that he sponsored him did the follow-up work. Now, I'm not saying that September
um,
Clark was wrong because they may not have had the same level of fidelity that was needed to really move the needle. I'm not
the
saying that.
organizations that sponsored the marches did not do follow-up work, by the way.
uh, I would, you know what? Let's dive into that. Let's dive into
Well, they
that.
didn't.
No,
They no. That's because if they had, Septima Clark would not have criticized. She didn't just criticize Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. She criticized him because he was considered a leader, but she criticized all these Black men who were celebrated at that time for being marching, locking arms up, and stuff like that. It's like there's actually behind the scenes work that's supposed to be doing, supposed to be done, and what our people have to see is that work being done. So I always tell our people, if all the work being done is secretive and mysterious, then I don't trust it.
I'm not sure if secretive and mysterious is a great definition of it, but I don't have my facts with me, so
That's because it's
I'm
secret
gonna
and
leave that.
mysterious. That's what I'm saying. That's why it's secret and mysterious. Black folks know about the marches, but the real work, a lot of people are like, I'm not sure. That's why it's called secret and mysterious, because the real stuff that people claim is happening, oh, don't nobody know. That's not the most discussed work, right? That's not the work that people want to talk about when it comes to talking about Black history. That's not the work that Black folks complain about schools not teaching. Black folks want schools to teach about slavery, a march, a Rosa Parks, but the real work behind the scenes, Black folks are not demanding that to be taught. And
I
Black
don't think
folks are
they
not
know
teaching
about
that
it.
in families and
Now,
communities
I don't think they know about that work,
because it's secretive. That's what I said.
but
It's secret and mysterious. I know.
hey, but you also know that most people know what happened on the TV show, but they don't know the work that went into making that TV show happen. Most people know how a pizza tastes, but everybody doesn't necessarily know all of the steps that it takes to create that pizza.
Well,
So
that's easy. Yeah, pizza take that's easy.
no,
TV
no, no, no.
shows,
But
now you can
that's
see
my
behind the
point
scenes
is
work.
we don't always we most people are going to focus on what they see and not what they don't see.
Yeah,
And
see, I don't give our people a pass on that because I don't do comparisons of TV shows and pizza. I want our people
you
to
don't, I
understand.
do. I think it's
No,
important to
no, we're more
understand that
intellectual
we
and
see
complex in those comparisons, Brother Varner.
the thing like look with our fraternities and our sororities. You know, you're in the best sorority, I'm in the best fraternity. People see what we do on the outside, they don't see what happens on the inside. And it's not
There,
because we hide it.
there's some nonsense on the inside too. So
Oh
since
no,
you
I'm
brought it
not
up,
saying look, I wasn't saying that all of it was above the board.
okay.
But I'm simply saying there's some things that happen that in our meetings, that even the public meetings, that people are not going to focus on, but they'll focus on us stepping. They'll
But that's
focus
our
on
fault, though.
our
Our fault.
pardon?
That's our fault. That's our fault. It's 100% based on what you want our people to know. If you only want our people to see you doing a fish fry, raising money without providing paperwork as to where the money raised is spent, which is actually a financial audit that organizations do, they just don't release the financial audits to Black folks, which is also what Marcus Garvey's problem was,
Well, we
then
don't
that's
ask
a
for them.
choice.
Now, our home offices do, you know, our headquarters do. They ask for those reports, but you know, Joe Schmo and the community league doesn't. They don't say, "Hey, yo, Omega, show us what you're doing."
That's their fault. They need to.
Oh
And
yeah,
this is
they do.
something
But my
that
point, but they will let you know that, hey, we saw y'all, you know, at the mall. We we saw we were at the party. Yeah.
mm-mm.
Look, I sold more tickets to one of our recent parties than I was able to get people to show up to a lot of our community service events. I have to fight harder to get people to go to the blood drive than I do to get people to go to the party. Now, that's not the fault of Omega. That's not
Well,
the
no,
fault of
most
the
people
chapter.
don't want to go to blood drives. I definitely don't want to go to a blood drive. So you have to figure out a different way to do it. So, for example, things like blood drives, you'll want to do it through an outlet that people would go to anyway, and therefore they're going to be there anyway. So they
We
see
do
that
it at the
here they
mall.
can get their heart tested, they can go to blood drive, they can pick up a fish plate. It has to, Black people have to change some stuff. When something's not working,
My point is, people are going to focus on some things and not everything. And so we don't necessarily, I mean, if we study, what's his name, Maynard Ferguson, we'll find out some of the things, and I'm not pushing him to the forefront. I'm simply saying that there were some things that happened and Rosa Parks was involved with a lot of the activities, and we know about her from the bus situation, but we don't know about some of the other things that Rosa Parks did.
and she wasn't the first person to get
No,
forcibly
no,
out.
she wasn't. It was the Claudette Colvin was one of the first. She wasn't the first either, but she was one of the first.
Our
Uh,
people have done this type of work all the time, and most of it's not made famous, right? So the point, though, is that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and them were celebrated back then and now for doing marches. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was not doing behind the scenes work. He was having meetings. He was not doing behind the scenes work.
I would dare say that some of the meetings is part of the work.
He was not doing behind the scenes work, though.
Well, I mean, that was Snick's job. Snick got him to be the front
Yes,
person.
you have mad excuses, yo. You got mad excuses.
Nah,
The
I'm just
excuses
letting
of
you know
tools of
how it is.
incompetence that Bill Bridges leading to nowhere. No, you got mad excuses though. I'm telling you. And this is another example that I want our people to understand. If our people cannot accept critique, including critique of the famous person that you celebrate, then you will never ever, ever, ever change anything. You will never evolve as a people beyond the revolution. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was known very well for marches and talking and stuff and preaching. But when it came to the actual changes to be done, he had other people do it. And he
Absolutely.
didn't do follow-ups to make sure they were doing it because he was all over the
Because
place.
he was at the next spot talking and rallying the troops so that
Right.
the other work could be done after he now
But you got to make
it's
sure
kind
people
of
are
like,
actually doing it, though. There has to be a
but see,
report. There has to be
everybody
some
can't do
evidence.
everything. Everybody cannot do everything.
But if
he
you're not
he,
making
he
sure
played his
people are doing
position.
it, then you ain't doing anything and they're not doing
Look,
anything either.
the quarterback is not going to take out the other
Oh,
quarterback.
you got mad
The
excuses,
quarterback
yo.
is
You got
the
mad
quarterback is
excuses.
getting the ball down.
If you,
Listen, we can't. Quarterback doesn't do everything.
the quarterback sucks anyway. The point, back to the point, is that if you say that other people are going to do it, just like Marcus Garvey, when he had all the accountants and the accountants were doing what they should do, but it stopped at a point of record keeping where they would have data to provide in case of an investigation to prove where the money spent for the ships, right? The damaged ships at that. You
The
have to do
UNIA had a
more.
lot of stuff that was happening.
Black
So
people have to do more than say, oh, I passed that on to so and so. This is called QA, quality assurance. Quality assurance is what all entities, all institutions, all organizations are supposed to have. Quality assurance means you're doing evaluations, you're doing assessments, you're doing data collection,
okay,
qualitative and quantitative.
we've moved from the point.
No, no, I'm
Yeah,
actually
yeah,
at the
because I
point.
mean the QA part, we can all agree with that. The point that I was saying though is we can't expect one person to do everything. And a lot of times because we don't know all the other things that happen, we assume that only what we see
Well,
is the activity.
September Clark was correct, though. Martin Luther King Jr. was not doing behind the scenes work, and he was not making
No,
sure behind the scenes work was being done.
he was the front man. So yes, she was
But
absolutely
behind the scenes
correct in
work
that.
was not being done,
He,
like I said.
okay, so he was the front man. She was absolutely correct in that.
And there was nobody
I
behind
only
the
learned
scenes doing
about her
work.
through you. So I learned a little more after we had our talk, and I agree with her criticisms. I'm not saying that she shouldn't have. I agree with the criticisms. I'm simply saying that everybody doesn't do everything.
Look here. You don't have to do everything. You have to do quality assurance to make sure that other people you told to do the work are actually doing the work. And that's not what was going on. That's her point. Her
Okay, so
point is that you all were good at tasks for protests and marches, but when it came to actual results, like voting ballot access, food
mm,
access, there wasn't the same presence and visibility of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the people who were part of his coalition. That is the fact back then, and that's a fact now. And Septima Clark called it out. And you can keep shrugging because you're trying to find so hard to make excuses. But I
I'm
tell
not
people,
making
you
excuses.
can
I'm
never
saying that
respect somebody so much that you're going to make every excuse for what was lacking in the evidence that they're supposed to provide of information and evidence beyond. And this is one thing I want our people to understand. If Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was making a whole lot of change making work, behind the scenes, he
did
would
he? Who
not be
said
just
that?
celebrated by white people. He
Who
would
said
not
that?
be a government holiday. White people would not be preaching his I Have a Dream. They would not even be talking about his march when he was talking about job status, particularly for black people. If he was doing real change making work behind the scenes to make some changes, real changes beyond talking about it and marching about it, trust and believe that he would not be considered a mainstream symbol of race neutral liberation, because that's what they use him for. And this is
Okay.
exactly the
I
point
think
that
that
Septima Clark is making here.
white supremacy, evil supremacy is always going to find ways to use us against ourselves.
I
And
don't believe
that's
in white supremacy. I don't believe that whites are supreme, but I will
well,
say
I'm not saying white is supreme. I'm saying, and my point has been this, that the leader and the front man or the front person aren't necessarily the same.
with
And
Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., it
Martin Luther
was the
King
same.
was the front person.
And the leader. He was the
No,
leader at that time as
he
well.
wasn't a leader.
He was the leader for his work. He was the leader for the marches. He was the person who was
He
at the
didn't even
center of
coordinate
the
the
talk.
marches.
Say that again.
He didn't coordinate the marches.
Coordinating the marches does not make you a leader. That makes you the
That's
coordinator.
the person who pulls everything. Okay, all right. Well, you know what?
Makes you a
I
coordinator for
I
a
I
march. That's not a
I think
leader.
we,
That's an
we're
administrative
probably
assistant.
splitting
Are you
hairs here,
serious?
but I do like what you presented tonight.
That's an administrative, talking about the person who coordinated the march. That's an administrative assistant. You understand? He had secretaries and stuff. Look here, Septima Clark called him out, but Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. respected Clark and declared Clark the mother of the movement, because she was
Yeah,
talking about some real work. I don't want to see all these marches. I want to see, what are y'all doing? And don't tell me to guess what y'all doing. Don't tell me to research more, because if Black folks have to research you more, figure out what you're doing, and there's some kind of mysterious work, then that means you're not doing anything. That's a time waster. And our people still use that time wasting in the 21st century, 2025.
I
Our
think
people are really
that's
good at wasting
uh,
time. Black politicians do that a lot. People say, when you ask Black politicians, well, what are you doing for our people? Oh, I do a lot. Here, research me. Here's my web. I ain't got to do nothing, because if I was not Black, you would never tell a non-Black person to research you. You would change your voice and say, let me tell you what I've been doing, because you know that that shapes your funders and your voters. It's Black people who are always given the bare minimum. People don't answer Black people's questions. Black people don't answer Black
agreed,
people's questions.
agreed, because agreed. And I think we're moving to a position where we're demanding things instead of accepting things.
That's
And I
always been
think
the
there needs to
case.
be more of it. There needs to be more of it.
Black people need to do more work beyond these protests and marches and
But
boycotts
to
and
quote
things.
Kendrick, it's not enough. We got to do more. I totally agree. It's not enough.
Okay. Black folks love to agree without actually doing something to change it. But okay. So Septima Clark stated, liberals, rather than urging bigger slices of the education, political, and employment pies for Black Americans, must begin to find ways to bake bigger pies. So that's on page 341 of that book. And this is an example also of what Septima Clark addressed, that we need to speak truth about oppressions without ignoring the problems within our people. So this is where what Septima Clark says on page 341 of the book compares to Harold Cruz's focus on our inner world. The emphasis on our inner world means that Black people wasting a whole lot of time preaching about oppression, talking about, oh, we're so oppressed, identified as oppressed. And I tell our people, we're not an oppressed people. Blackness is not synonymous with oppression. We can talk about problems, but we have problems within, and that includes problems that existed long before invaders came to African lands. So therefore, you can talk about external problems, but do not use it as a time waster, distraction, and a procrastination from the inner development. And of course, Harold Cruz looked at it in terms of drug use, all types of things that are going on, and that's still the case there. So this is where people can get to the writings, and people can email me at kimya@kimyaindennis.com, or go to my LinkedIn, my link tree, not on LinkedIn, if they want to get information. So this is the Shirley Graham Du Bois writings.
Okay.
And this is a wonderful doctoral dissertation about the artistry and activism of Shirley Graham Du Bois. So again, understanding how art is a central component of everything. And this is Amy Ashwood Garvey's work here. So some writings regarding that. And Amy Ashwood Garvey was also friends with Claudia Jones. So Claudia Jones, I have a shared Google Drive with Claudia Jones's writings. And there's also a book about Claudia Jones that I have. It's called The Left of Marx. So Claudia Jones being very prolific. She was considered to have more leftist views than Karl Marx, and she was a Marxist. And you'll see her like they'll talk about her in Europe a lot, also in parts of the Caribbean. And there's Amy Jackie Garvey, so her writing regarding women as leaders, and then the parts of the book Garvey and Garveyism, that's only parts of the book. The Veiled Garvey, that entire book is the life and times of Amy Jackie Garvey. So the entire book is on my shared Google Drive. And the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, edited by Amy Jackie Garvey. And I think that's part of the book because there are different versions of it. And last but not least, the amazing Septima Clark. So the Septima Clark, some readings up here. And the second link here is only for the link for the Freedoms Teacher. So you cannot find that for free online. You actually have to purchase the book. And but the developmental up here, the first link is actually a journal article, so you can read that. It's very interesting. And Septima Clark, she didn't fuss, but she did let people know that we have a lot of excuses. We think that we're explaining things, but sometimes we're explaining things in a way that's trying to distract and make excuses. So, and that happens a lot for our people. Our people, when we're asking for evidence from each other, our people do a similar thing that non-Blacks do to us, which is instead of responding with evidence, we say, oh, there's more to the story than that, or, there's so much to it. And I always tell people, if I ask for information, if I ask for data, if I ask for evidence, if I ask for explanation, I don't want you to preach about the complexities and how it's difficult to find, just so you don't have it. Or say that you want to keep it a secret from our people, and that includes Black folks keeping it a secret from our people, so that we can know that you're probably not doing any real work, or that some real work you're doing is not to advance our people. And again, that is another critique that Septima Clark has. It's easy to go protest, march, and say that you're doing some justice work. The hard part is actual evidence that there's real work being done. And that's where Martin Luther King Jr. and them, they were considered trailblazers at that time, but the behind the scenes work is not known very much now for a reason. Because if they were doing a whole lot of behind the scenes work back then, trust and believe our people would know about it more now. And that would be the main part of books and writings about Martin Luther King Jr., because he does a lot of writings about himself as well. But a lot of the work is not the central component. Instead, it's his sermons, it's his lectures, it's his protests. So I tell our people, if you're doing some real work beyond just talking and marching, that needs to be what you show our people, not the surface level stuff, because you're wasting our time and you're distracting Black folks from some real change making work. So there we go.
There we go. As classmates, another great class with the great doctor. Leave your comments in the chat. Let us know what you're thinking. Let us know what you learned. Let us know what you think about Septima Clark. Yeah. Let us know what you think about Amy Jack Garvey, and what was the first Garvey?
Amy Ashford Garvey, and then before that, Shirley Graham Du Bois.
Yeah. Let us know what you think about them, and we'll look forward to talking with you next time. Peace.